Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth in our series of Big Ideas webinars. These programs are part of our planning and preparation for marking the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. I'm Sarah Curitan, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it is my honor to welcome you to today's program. Revolution NJ, a partnership between the Commission and nonprofit Crossroads of the American Revolution, is dedicated to advancing the role that history plays in public discourse, community engagement, education, tourism, and scholarship in New Jersey. Through programs like this one, we seek to explore the history of the American Revolution, its context, and its legacy, thereby galvanizing diverse audiences statewide into embracing the enduring value and relevance of history. Now, today, we consider one of those big ideas that impact the way we understand the past, the way we perceive our lives today, and the way we envision the future. And today, we consider another really big idea. How do we know what we know? So to get us started, I'm delighted to turn the program over to our program coordinator, Dr. Mark Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our fourth Big Ideas concept panel, and we're specifically looking at how do we know what we know? And if you've joined us since the beginning of these panel series, you've probably already heard of some of these larger ideas about identity, society, what is revolution, and how to approach them a little bit more critically. And if you haven't been able to join us for those, don't worry, we have them on our YouTube page for the New Jersey Historical Commission, and they are available as a free resource for anyone who wants to dive into those topics further. I bring up our past sessions because they're important in framing our discussion today, especially concerning what questions you should consider when looking at any resource. So how do we really know what we know? Admittedly, this is an amorphous topic that begs us to reflect on ways in which our knowledge about the world is both constructed and limited. And what does this mean for us on the ground? We have the distinct privilege of living in a time with abundant information available at our fingertips. However, with this increased availability of information, we find ourselves overwhelmed with how much is out there and the ways in which that information is shared with us. It's easy to feel lost in the sea of noise, a cacophony of ideas, opinions, and perspectives. And also this is occurring in an age of increased polarization and a 24-hour news cycle, where the veracity of research projects and reports are often called into question. This is not necessarily a bad thing. To be critical of sources is important. However, often this is done with ideological blinders on, where our biases push us towards the familiar. Under these conditions, it's imperative that we become critical of the things we consume in all facets of our lives. In recent years, there's been media literacy campaigns that have taken root, pushing folks to question the news, videos, posts, and resources they engage with on a day-to-day basis. In the realm of history, a similar reckoning has occurred, with folks revisiting stories with new evidence and lines of questions, often challenging our fundamental assumptions about the past. This can be very disconcerting for many folks who have very real attachments to particular people's stories and events that they grew up with. However, such work is important, and it shows us that, as Grace Lee Boggs reminds us, history is not the past, it's the stories we tell about the past. And that is the crux of today's session. Discussing how we know what we know can lead us down many rabbit holes, ranging from philosophical to ideological debates about the creation of knowledge. For the sake of this session, though, we will focus on only one small part of the equation, and that is the archive. What is the archive? How is it constructed? What is included and left out? Who makes the decisions on what to preserve and why? How does it limit our knowledge of the past? How does this affect the way we understand the present? As you can tell, there's a lot to consider when engaging the archives and the resources they hold. Today's panelists will specifically explore what the archive is, why we should approach it with a critical eye, and strategies for how to read the archive, both for what is preserved and what's left out of the record. With that being said, I would love to introduce our moderator for this session, Dr. O'Brassill-Kulfan. Dr. O'Brassill-Kulfan is an assistant teaching professor and coordinator of public history in the history department at Rutgers University-New Brunswick, New Jersey. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Leicester and an MA in modern history from Queen's University, Belfast. She researches poverty, labor, mobility, crime and punishment in the early American Northeast, and is the author of Vagrants and Vagabonds, Poverty and Mobility in the Early American Republic, from the New York University Press. Her next book project explores the evolution of the poverty line through the subsistence activities of people experiencing poverty in early America. As a practicing public historian, she has previously worked as an archivist and research analyst for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives Archives, with museums, archives, and libraries in the US and the UK curating exhibits, managing archival collections, and creating inclusive public programming. She is co-chairing the New Jersey Historical Commission's Advisory Council on the state's semi-quincentennial commemoration, and recently received the Commission's Award of Recognition for Outstanding Service to Public Knowledge and Preservation of History of New Jersey. She is currently working on a project about historical materialism in public history, interpretation, and commemorations. Please welcome Dr. Rizzo Guptan.
Thank you so much, Mark and Sarah. It is such a privilege to be here with you all today and to have the opportunity to introduce our two panelists. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and to have the opportunity to learn from you both. So thank you so much for being here. Dr. Britt Rusert is Associate Professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's the author of Fugitive Science, Empiricism and Freedom in Early African-American Culture, and co-editor of W.E.B. Du Bois Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, a collection of the visual graphics Du Bois and his students at Atlanta University prepared for the 1900 Paris Exposition. Rusert received her PhD in English and certificate in feminist studies from Duke University. Her new project is an intensive study of William J. Wilson's African-American Picture Gallery from 1859, which is a text that imagines the first museum of Black art in the United States. That project is supported by a 2019 NEH Summer Stipend and a 2019-2020 ACLS Fellowship. Rusert is also writing a short history of abolition that uses abolitionist experiments from the antebellum period to make concrete connections to radical organizing today, especially to movements around environmental justice, mutual aid, prison abolition, and community defense initiatives led by queer, trans, people of color, and Black women. And Ms. Joy Bivins was named the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in June of 2021. Bivins joined the Schomburg, a division of the New York Public Library and a leading repository for archival materials related to the African diaspora and African-American life, history, and culture, in 2020 as an associate director of collections and research services. Previously, she served as the chief curator of the International African-American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, and the director of curatorial affairs at the Chicago History Museum. Ms. Bivins has nearly 2 decades of expert leadership and extensive curatorial knowledge in the art and culture of the African diaspora and holds degrees from the University of Michigan and Cornell University. And she's a proud native of the South Side of Chicago. I'm so looking forward to our conversation today. So thank you so much for being here, Britt and Joy. Our focus for today's panel is, as Mark was sharing, a gigantic philosophical question. How do we know what we know about the past? There are plenty of logical, sensible ways to answer that question through archival evidence, through artifacts and historic sites. All of that is true and fair game. But how much of human history is represented in the archival record? Who created the sources that led to the dominant written narratives that we encounter on a daily basis? As scholars who work at intersections of class, race, gender, and labor histories, we know that the sources that are pointed to as objective historical truths tell only a fraction of the story. All archives and all histories contain silences and gaps. As the historian and philosopher Michel Rothschild said in his book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, there are two types of historical truth, that which happened and that which is said to have happened. The scholars who will be speaking with us today are wrestling with that distinction daily. So we have a series of questions to guide our conversation, and we'd like to start with the more concrete, and then we can move on to the abstract and theoretical. So, Britt, Joy, how have you used archival material in your research to broaden your understanding of both the past and the present?
I'll start, if you don't mind, Britt. Because my work is a little bit different, I think, from traditional academic scholarship, in the sense that most of my career I've spent creating projects, interpretive projects for broad audiences and for different publics. And the first 15 years of my work was at an urban history museum that had a very robust archival collection. We often said we had 20 million. I think by the time I left the Chicago History Museum, it was 22 million objects. And people think object, they think a three-dimensional thing. But really what we were talking about was papers. What we were talking about was manuscripts and archival material. And the strength of that collection really informed all of what we were able to produce for different publics. So, and that work was a bit different from what happens at the Schomburg, because it was not focused necessarily on one particular population, rather the breadth of a very urban city that has a lot of different people, a lot of folks who made contribution in different ways. And I think one of the ways in which those collections helped to inform the work that we did was to bring to light some communities that have been thought to be new to the city, or only occupy a particular space within the city, because what we saw, what most of us see is what we're working with, right? We understand history in a very kind of narrow, myopic way. And many of us think as things are is how they've always been. And often the archive helps to correct that assumption. And so we produced projects, exhibitions, publications that spoke to the breadth and diversity of a very complex urban environment, right? And it often helped us to prove that people were in places where people might have missed them. And I'll give you a really great, an example I use all the time. I don't know if it's great, but whenever you do these kinds of interpretive projects that are very public, and the people come, they read your labels, they look at your objects, they look at the case that you are making, everybody has something to say. Everybody is an expert. Everybody remembers it a different way. So I would often get called, and in one particular instance, we did an exhibition on the Mexican-American community on the very far south side of Chicago. I promise I'm gonna talk about the Schomburg, but I'm trying to thread a needle here. And a community that had a similar, I would say, story that the African-American community in Chicago had around the turn of the 20th century, as these large industrial corporations or industries were looking for workers, right? And so they didn't just look in the United States, they looked south of the border, and therefore there was a community of Mexican workers who made their home on the very far south side of the city, near the lake, near where all that industry was booming, and settled there and grew a very robust and rich community. And I had a phone call from a woman who told me that there were no Mexican Americans in her neighborhood. And she grew up in that community and she didn't see them. And so I had to explain to her, just because you didn't see them, doesn't mean they weren't there, right? And the evidence is pointing to the fact that they had churches, they built institutions, and much of that institutional life was around the church, which is why I brought it up. And so these records, these documents often allow us to put people, not just place them in time, but place them in various parts of a location where they it may be that it's thought that they were not there, right? So it is a way, these records allow us to bring people back into conversations and create a more robust conversation about the communities in which we live, right? So I think of the archives in very on the ground, in an on the ground sense, right? It helps us to get to know our neighbors better, because a lot of times we're just working with what we were taught in school, or what our parents or our family saw, or those communities that are very colloquial, and not necessarily looking and having a broader sense of where we are and who's there with us.
I thought maybe I would just say something about my position as someone who teaches and works in an interdisciplinary Black Studies department who has a PhD in English. So my training was very interdisciplinary, but it was also really theoretical. Since I wasn't trained in the history department, I was doing a lot of theory, working in literature. So I was being taught a lot of kind of theories of the archive, but not receiving any training at all on actually how to do that work. And so I wrote a whole dissertation that was about thinking about the intersections of race and science in the 19th century. And I was specifically interested in how African Americans were responding to race science in the 19th century. And then I defended my dissertation, and I got a month-long fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, and it was literally the first time I had been in an archive. And it was just, I remember having just this experience of like, wow, that first encounter with like primary documents, and to see what you can learn and how it can expand your understanding of things that you already thought that you knew through that kind of encounter. It really kind of changed the trajectory of my career, I would say, and it also kind of changed the trajectory of my project. When I was doing my dissertation that wasn't really engaged with archival objects and collections, I think I had like a really top-down understanding of things. And I love this idea that Joy's talking about, like what voices, the archive is actually being a place where we can see some voices that we don't think otherwise, that we wouldn't expect to see them there or hear them there. And so I think that for me, when I went to write my first book, doing that work engaged in archives and in those spaces, it just allowed me to have a more bottom-up approach to my topic. And it really nuanced my understanding of my topic and my intervention. And, I'll just tell you two kind of like little discoveries that I made in the course of that project, which was, I had, again, like this idea I really didn't realize until I got into the archive. And at that moment, I was also really benefiting from the digitization that has happened around African American periodicals, especially in the 19th century. When I was writing my dissertation, a lot of that stuff wasn't digitized. And once I was done, a lot of it was. And what I encountered once I started going through the sources was I expected to see a narrative around a suspicion of science, or I expected to see narratives about critiques of racial science and medical exploitation and harm. And all of that was there. But in addition to that, there was like a really enthusiastic and robust engagement with natural science as it was emerging in that moment. So, African Americans who are thinking about electrobiology, geology, like all, comparative anatomy, engaged and interested in all these different kinds of scientific fields. And there was nothing that I had read in any theoretical source in grad school that would have led me to know that that was the case. So, I think we're in a moment where, it's the case that a lot of people, I think, in the academy, people who work in libraries, archivists, and I think folks who work at historic sites have an understanding that the archive is constructed, right? That the archive is connected to institutions of, of power, that we have to think about the history of these things, how they were constructed, that we're not just receiving raw data. At the same time, I don't know, I still hold out a lot of hope for archival discovery, and we don't actually know that things aren't there until we look for them, and I guess I'll just finally say, I also had this experience early on when I was at the Antiquarian Society, where I was working on this figure I've been working on him for a couple of years. His name's Robert Benjamin Lewis. He was an Afro-Native man who lived in southern Maine. He had some connections to abolitionists in Boston, and he published this really interesting ethnology, this kind of, sort of history and theory of the races and the organization of human difference in the 1830s. And I had worked on this text for years, and I thought I had kind of gone through all of the relevant catalog items at the Antiquarian Society. And one day I saw this entry that I hadn't seen before, and it said that it was an image. And I was like, well, that can't be right. But I called it up anyway, and it came to me, and I opened up the folder, and it was an image of Robert Benjamin Lewis. And it was just such an incredible moment because, I think because of, African Americans' lack of access to image technologies, to photography, to these kinds of things in the period, and because these are voices and subjects who have been marginalized, you don't expect to come across an image. Douglas, we see pictures of Douglas. We know. I had just sort of assumed. Again, it was this assumption that I've been told these are such scarce sources, and there are so few images. That narrative of scarcity, I think, actually sometimes shapes our perspective. And does that make sense? I don't know if this I'm going to stop talking to us, but it was just. I guess I'm just saying that sometimes the stuff is there. And when we want to understand voices, that are non-dominant, when we want to understand, the perspective of poor folks, of people of color, of queer folks, of trans folks in the past, we do have to keep looking because some of those things are actually there.
Thank you both so much. That's actually a perfect segue into the next question that I wanted to ask, which is about kind of perspectives on how we approach looking at archival evidence. So the kind of framing for this question comes from a brilliant archivist and graduate student in anthropology, Jarrett Drake, who did some incredible work on the Van Wickle slave ring in New Jersey. So in this case, in 1818, about 14 years after the passage of the state's gradual abolition law, a judge in Middlesex County, Jacob Van Wickle, engaged in the illegal sale of enslaved people from New Jersey to Louisiana. In order to do this, he had to provide legal documentation that the people he wanted to sell and move to Louisiana had consented to that sale and movement. He provided that evidence. If we look at this on the surface level, based on just the legal documentation that Van Wickle himself generated, it seems that the law is being followed. But reading these sources critically raises a lot of questions about agency and consent and legality and human life. If we look at other archival sources, we see that Van Wickle was claiming that the cries of a 6-week-old infant counted as verbal consent to be sold and moved to Louisiana. Her voice was being misrepresented. Van Wickle was producing false archival evidence. Whose voices are usually represented in your research area, and whose voices are you searching for, not sure if you might find in the archive? And what voices can be found? This is kind of to Dr. Russert's question about, some that you imagine don't exist, but then maybe you get lucky and can find them. And all of this is tied up in this question of how does one read against the archival grain, right? How do you kind of draw connections and look for ways to kind of bridge the gaps in the archival evidence that's there based off of other forms of knowledge, sometimes vernacular, sometimes from other types of sources. So I'd love to just hear you both speak about the voices that you find in the archives and how you read against the grain.
That's intense. The example is intense in many ways. And here is where I would argue that it's not just reading. One way that I could think about reading against the grain has to do with the framework that you bring to the reading, right? So as a scholar who or a person who's worked primarily in African-American studies, Black studies, diaspora studies, my spidey sense would immediately go up, right? because I understand or have been grounded in a conceptual idea that that Black people here have always been in resistance, have always been striving for liberation, even in very confined contexts. And so I would be suspicious. And I think that that what you raised there is that how you see the archive or how you see the documents, the evidence has a lot to do with how you frame the world, right? What you're bringing to the material, because we do bring, bias was mentioned, but also informed ideas about the past and about the struggles and the, I would say, conventional role or conventional ideas that have permeated African-American history, African-American intellectual thought from the time that Black people arrived here in the US. So that would have automatically made me wonder, but it also particularly with the cries of the 6-month-old would cause me to think about that relationship between enslaved and enslaver, right? The ownership, just because the law changes doesn't mean that one's philosophy of ownership changes, right? And so that has to always be part of all of these contextual clues, or understanding the historic moment, understanding the typical ideology of the dominant culture vis-a-vis the marginalized has to be part of that reading as well. And I think that is part of how I would have read that source. I had a conversation just the other day with an artist who was like, well, what if I can't find this particular thing? And I was like, well, sometimes you have to back into it, right? You can't just think, I want to know X and I'm going to find X. Sometimes you have to look at all the people who lived around X or what was going on in that community at the time to make some informed assumptions about your particular subject, because it may not be, it's probably not written as you imagine or as you need. You have to kind of create as you're going along, and you have to ask a different set of questions. So.
Yeah, and I think we know, that you don't want to like look at a document and take it at face value. I definitely think differently about sources. Like if I'm in the Schomburg and I'm thinking about a collection that's rooted in, a Black collector, and to think about what his priorities were and what those materials are, that's like a different space than if you're working at like the Massachusetts Historical Society and you're looking at like, ledgers of planters and enslavers, right? So I think, again, just thinking, I think that idea about the framework is really helpful, and to again think about the institution, the institution of slavery, and then how did this collection get into a particular space? I more and more try to spend time understanding the provenance of collections, and to understand, and just to even, even, I don't know if I want to use the language of bias, but even the narratives produced around particular documents and collections, someone has made decisions, right? So sometimes it can be helpful to know, did someone write about this collection and is giving me information about what I'm going to find here? Did they write that 2 years ago? Was that written 50 years ago? I just think all of those different levels can help you kind of understand how the image or the document or the manuscript that you're reading has been constructed even before you start getting into the sources. I also like really think it's important. I think it's true, especially when we're thinking about the history of colonialism, slavery. We're thinking about history of indigenous peoples in the Americas. That oftentimes even firsthand accounts are compromised. And so I think that is a really good place to just start with that assumption. Um, but and Joy, you use the language of suspicion. I think that's like actually a really good comportment with a lot of these kinds of documents. Just start there. Um, but then once you're kind of on that page, I do actually think methodologies from beyond history are really helpful. And this is I met Mark when he took my early African American print culture class, and one of the things I remember loving about that particular iteration of the class is that we had students from anthropology, from English, from history, from African American studies, folks who were doing certificates in gender and sexuality studies, and I think a lot of students and researchers and folks think that this is really the historian's province, and and I think yeah, artists, I think people from different disciplinary positions and from who do different kind of work have different methodologies and have different kinds of reading practices that can be really helpful for reading against the grain. Personally, I wish historians would learn a little bit more about how other folks might approach and think about the archives. I think it took me a long time when I started doing this work. I think at the beginning, I was really trying to learn how to think like a historian. And I think more and more I am trying to just be more confident in terms of my own training, my own background, and to have faith that yeah, methodologies from Black studies, from gender and sexuality studies, from post-colonial studies, that these are fields now that have been thinking about the politics of the archive for a long time, and we deserve to also have a say in terms of how these sources are read and interpreted.
Thank you both so much. You really highlighted why half of historical work is about interpretation beyond just research, and that's why we revisit what historians have said generations ago, right? Because of the ideas that they brought with them into the archive when they were looking at those sources in the first place, or when the archivist was putting together that collection. And it invites us to think about the conditions in which archival records are created and in which archives, collections are created. And I read things differently. I'm a historian, but I used to work as an archivist, and I used a database of interviews conducted between managers of almshouses, which were kind of 19th century sort of versions of homeless shelters, in the interest of a short description, and where people experiencing poverty were coerced into giving an interview that was then recorded and written down their life story, right? So I view those differently than other historians because I'm thinking about it from the perspective of an archivist. If that person brought that volume in, carried it around, the reason you see groups of women together in the records are because they were walking through the building and the women were in segregated cells. And so it all starts to kind of fit together and begin to make sense. So I'd love for us to talk a little bit more about archival methods and how archives are constructed and maintained, who uses them and to what ends. And each of you pointed to that answer a little bit in thinking about from a disciplinary perspective in particular. But some of the ideas behind our framing of this question are, the idea that you don't know what you don't know, and the limits of our own perspectives as archivists, as scholars who are working with materials, and how people might think about approaching archival records if they haven't spent a lot of time with a lot of these questions around provenance and all of that.
I might be a little less helpful about those specific questions about the archive. I think Joy might be able might be better equipped to answer some of those questions. I can say something about maybe using a diversity of archival methods as a way of kind of reading sources and doing this kind of work. And this kind of extends from that question of, maybe not being super naive about the status of these documents and the information that we're going to glean from them. So I'm just trying to think of a couple of little tricks I have or things that I've learned over the past several years, I guess at this point. Is that okay if I say something like that? So one thing is, I think if you're in an archive, the archive itself can provide you with other trails and breadcrumbs and other things to follow. So if you have a kind of discovery and you learn something, you can use other sources there. including your librarians who know so much. Do not underestimate your librarians. They know so much more than you do. So contact them early. Make sure you talk to them before you get on site. Make sure you talk to them during your visit. They're like just a wealth of information and knowledge and expertise. So, I think like that can be really powerful, the kind of research that you can do with the sources on site. But again, it can be a little bit of a trap because you're in an institutional culture in a collection that's organized by particular principles and norms and cultures. So again, I think it's about like being strategic and also being smart about your research, because if I have one chapter in my book that's about Sarah Mapps Douglas, who was an instructor at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. And I didn't know much about her until I went to a fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And I ended up benefiting so much from the sources there. But when I went home and kind of looked at the chapter that I wrote while I was at the Library Company, it felt like it was almost too attached to those particular sources at that I had encountered at that space. And it actually took me a long time to kind of like widen my perspective and draw in sources from other places. And I had to kind of reframe it, if that makes sense. So like, I actually do think it's like taking what you can from that particular space, but then supplementing it from other sources and archives is really important. I think if you're like I work in African-American cultural history and literary history in the 19th century. And if I learn something that comes from like the New York Tribune, for example, I always go back to Black sources. So everything I learn, I almost always go back and like, what does the Freedoms Journal say about this? What did Frederick Douglass's paper say about this? And, I think a lot of those sources will even be covering kind of like mainstream like political events or happenings in the period, and they might provide a different kind of perspective. And I guess just the final thing that I'll say is, it took me a really long time to learn that the 19th century is not that far away from us generationally, and there are still people alive connected to some of our historical figures. And I learned this from Randall Burkett, who's someone I wonder if Joy might also know, at Emory, who is just like a kind of wealth of knowledge in fields of African-American history. And there was a figure that I was working on, and I kind of learned from him and a couple of other folks that like, yeah, you actually can find someone who's related to this figure that you're working on. And maybe I think probably historians are more apt to know that this is something you can do, but it really, just to think, again, not just about library sources and archives, but like community members, community knowledge, oral transmission of information, and that there's, if you work in marginalized archives, there are people in the community who are really passionate about this history and these sources, including family members and descendants, from the period. And I have learned that has just really helped to flesh out my own research and certain omissions and problems with my projects. And it's just like really enriched the kind of research that I do as well. So just talking to folks is also a good thing, I think, as well.
So I think anytime you talk about, I might get a little meta here, and this is probably where I will say the most, because the Schomburg Center, it exists this very, it's a unique place, right? It's a singular place in many ways. It has a history that is nearly a century old right now. We celebrate our centennial beginning in 2025 into 2026. The actual division of Negro literature, history, and prints starts in 1925 at the 135th Street branch of the library, the New York Public Library. The Schomburg personal collection, Arturo Schomburg's personal collection, is purchased by the New York Public Library in 1926, and then moved to the 135th Street branch library, becomes part of that special collection, right? So it's a why I say it can get very meta is because this special collection, this archive, is living within a branch library that's serving everyone, right? It's serving the community There is no Black studies field to speak of. It is being created through the collection of these materials, through the dedication of these librarians who are really creating resources that don't exist, like they're stepping into a vacuum within the field of historical scholarship, all kinds of scholarship. And why I say it can get kind of meta is because while we collect papers in, people's papers, Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, all the folks, you think we should have, we also collect across medium, right? So we also have moving image and recorded sound. So there's audio and video, and there's also robust photography and prints collection, kind of speaking to that scarcity of resources that you had mentioned earlier about imagining. And when I say that imagining, I really am focusing on the image of Black people from the 19th century, early 20th century. And what you're seeing is something different, I think, that then is posited within many of our textbooks about the lives that Black people are living. Yes, Black people are marginalized. The purpose of this collection, the purpose of this archive is to center, put at the center of the story, Black life, right? And the ways in which it's happening and what we're creating, whether that's literature, whether that is fine art, because we have this it's crazy, right? It's a crazy art and artifacts collection. We collect from photographers who were not just portraitists, but also art, fine art photographers. So there's kind of all of this stuff that is archival, but it's not a traditional archive in the sense that we think of it, right? Because it really can't be. If we are saying that we're documenting the history and culture of people of African descent, that already means that we have to look at life across different medium of cultural production. And so that's why I say it's meta, because it's an archive. We really archive ourselves as well. We document ourselves pretty robustly. We have a project called Home to Harlem, which is looking at the seed collection of this center, of this collection, which then became the Schomburg Center. So we have these different iterations, we have different periodizations, and we also have our own gaps. And that is how we are reshaping our collection, right? Gender is a gap. The representation of women creators is a gap within our collection. Queer history is a gap within our collection. So when you start to think about the past, what's not there is instructive, right? Particularly within a collection that is documenting a marginalized group, right? So who were we also leaving out? Who were we not thinking about? Or who are our predecessors not thinking about? And then you have to come to terms with the fact that the same questions are going to be asked of you if we're fortunate enough to continue this institution into the future, right? So there's the archive, the building of the archive, but within a very kind of Black studies kind of framework, but within a Black studies framework, we're also building institution, and we have to continue the institution. So it's all these things, these kind of currents that are running concurrently, if you will. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. I especially appreciate your attention to thinking about how to identify what's missing, right? And trying to be kind of self-reflective about that as a collections manager. I think that's really obvious for a lot of people, anyone who's done like genealogy research of thinking, how impossible is it to find the name that your great-great-grandmother was born with, right? Because of the way archives have been kept, right? Exactly.
You would have all of these great collections at the Chicago History Museum, and it'd be like Mr., Mrs. I'm like, what was this woman's name?
Right?
Somebody had just written it down anyway. And then it becomes work that you wouldn't have had to do if somebody had thought of her name as being important enough to be documented and recorded.
Exactly. A whole human being who you can barely identify in the record. And there's so much more that could be said about her life. So thank you both so much for that. So I have one more question that has both like a narrow and wider frame. And so as Mark mentioned at the beginning of our session today, these programs are linked with Revolution NJ, the Historical Commission's partnership with Crossroads to prepare for and commemorate and explore the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. So with that in mind, and with the conversation we've been having so far today about the archival method and the intellectual perspectives that we bring to our research, with all of that in mind, what should individuals seeking to explore and research more diverse and inclusive stories know and look for and think about ahead of the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States? How do you think the critical use of archival evidence in commemorating the 250th might change the sort of narratives that have emerged compared to perhaps the bicentennial in 1976? And where might people get started with research to tell these more inclusive stories?
Well, I think you could start with, I was thinking about like Erica Armstrong Dunbar's work on Own a Judge. I love Cassandra Pybus's book about runaway slaves and the kind of global quest of freedom, about, the enslaved people of, people who are enslaved by Washington, by Jefferson, like the fact that in this revolutionary era, you had people who were doing revolutionary things, who had escaped from founding fathers and kept kept the name Washington, for example, right? Or kept these kind of names. I just think like there's just been a lot of good work over the past few years that I think, the Hemmingses of Monticello, Annette Gordon Reed's book, just at this point, there's so much robust work that is so deeply rooted in archives that helps us like reconceptualize how we think about this whole moment of the American Revolution. So I would just probably start, I can put them in the chat, but I would maybe start with those books. Because I found like those 3 books, I just find really kind of inspirational in terms of reconceiving a narrative around the American Revolution, and also just so rooted in, the archive in a way that I think it is just feels very inspirational in terms of thinking about some of these questions now. And maybe I would just say one, I don't know if this is connecting, but it's one thing I did want to say before we close. I think there is some like gatekeeping that sometimes happens around archives in terms of like protocols for how you use the space, what you do before you go in the space. And one thing that I often tell my students is that these are actually protocols and norms that have been developed by particular libraries, and they don't necessarily travel to other places. Does that make sense? So if you go to one place and you have to wash your hands, you have to wear gloves, or it just can feel like there's a high bar to access, in part because you think that there's all these things that you're supposed to know and you don't know them. I just like to tell students that like, okay, everything new can be a little scary. If you start out with an archive or a collection that's like very formal and there's a lot of rules, it doesn't mean that you don't know what you're supposed to already know. It's okay. Everybody has to learn that process. And the protocol is probably going to be completely different when you go to another place. Does that make sense? I just think sometimes with this kind of work, part of the thing that keeps certain people and certain like bodies out of these spaces, because they're often very white, they're often like, they're, for folks who work in like queer and trans history, I think sometimes these can be hard spaces too. But I just think like, these narratives and history and scholarship on the past is only going to get better the more people and the more diverse kinds of groups of people have access to them. And I just think that people have to be okay with kind of like trying it. And I don't know if any of this makes sense. It's just like, I think there is gatekeeping around norms and protocols and policies. And it's really important for students and researchers and community members to feel like they can have access to these spaces and that they are wanted and they deserve to be there as well. And I'll put those book titles in the chat.
I think to that point, and this is a plug for the Schomburg because we're part of the New York Public Library, and we work very hard to make sure that that experience is not so mitigated. We watch you because people, we have to watch our collections and make sure that we can steward them into future generations, but we definitely try to close the gap between who's considered a researcher, right? Of course, both of you all can, how to do this, we offer classes to help you understand. We offer lib guides to help you understand what researching at the Schomburg actually is, and how it can be done. And we are here for you to do your work as long as it takes for you to do your work. That said, I don't have anything super different to contribute to thinking about the semi-quincentennial and how we reframe it. I think that from the time of the bicentennial, I was not conscious at that point, but even in my lifetime, moving away from just understanding Crispus Attucks as the first Black man to be killed as part of the freedom struggle is a win, right? I think for me, and I haven't seen this borne out in the archives, but I'm sure it's there, is the international nature of the Black freedom struggle during the time of the revolution, right? So you have Black people joining the loyalist cause. You have people being migrating from the US to Canada, then back to Africa. So there's still kind of this very interesting conversation that's happening that's diasporic. I think about the limits of freedom, and that is exciting to me. Like, what happens to those people who decide not to stay after they see that freedom really isn't an option because of that war, the Revolutionary War. And I'm just, even the earlier conversation about gradual emancipation is one that I think is worth exploring, folks knowing more about. And I'm not talking about scholars, y'all know it, but the public is often not privy to this kind of information, and I think it's a disservice. So any ways that we can utilize our resources, our platforms to help people understand kind of a fuller picture of slavery and freedom during the time of the revolution is worthwhile.
Thank you both. And Joy, that's a great segue into our first audience question from Noelle Lorraine Williams from the New Jersey Historical Commission. She asks, do you have any recommendations for evaluating resources for general audiences? Is there a different interpretive strategy for general audiences that you tend to use? So thinking about that distinction you just highlighted, Joy, between what's well documented in the scholarship but hasn't yet pervaded into general kind of public consciousness.
Well, here's where I think museums and our historical societies and these kinds of institutions are so critical, even libraries to that end, public libraries, is because the information is interpreted for broad publics, right? So the best thing you can do as a curator or as an exhibition developer dealing with a historic idea or a history theme is to open it up. You know all the stuff, but you have to make decisions about what you share with the public, and make it create a space where people can become curious about the past, right? And then get further into that lifelong learning on their own. I'm not into directing people in terms of how they should do their own research, but we do have responsibilities in these spaces to create space for people to understand some of what's going on in the academy, because oftentimes, and this is, it's not history, it's a lot of disciplines. It's folks are talking to each other, right? You're arguing points with one another. You're revising so-and-so's theory from what, and as a general audience member, I don't know that. So how can you help to bring me into the conversation in a way that is useful for my own life and maybe gets me to ask some more questions?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of this work, but when I've taken my academic work and then, have been asked to translate it to a more public audience, I often go back to the things that just at first made me, that language of curiosity, I think is so key, like curious about the topic and excited about it. And leading with discoveries, I think is a way to get people engaged and interested. And I think it's absolutely true that, scholars, when they're doing like scholarly work, have to, make it very clear what their critical intervention is. They have to, these interventions are and ideas are often mired in a lot of kind of like, historiographic work or scholarly citation. And sometimes it's just, you have to go back to like I think we all intuitively know what is of interest to a general public, because it's probably the thing that was of interest to you at the beginning. And so maybe tapping into that is a good way to proceed in terms of thinking about access to a public audience.
Absolutely. I think those are both brilliant perspectives, especially because the thing that seems to hold true no matter what is that if the scholar always has a question, but the way that scholarship is often presented is as if we assume there's inherent value in any story, but really you're trying to figure something out. And I think that as you mentioned, that process of discovery and curiosity can be a much more vital way to share that story. So if it's okay with you, I've cleared it with Mark that we can go 5 minutes over to answer a remaining question from our audience here. And the final question is, how do approaches to the archive help counter those who are dedicated to a traditional view of history, perhaps in denial of nuance or critical understanding of the past? So this speaks to the kind of polarized contemporary dialogue that Mark was referring to at the beginning. And I think that this question sort of raises that tension around believing that the archive holds objective truth, while also recognizing how subjective our interpretations of it are.
And here's where I go back to the idea of an intellectual thought framework, right? I don't know that many of us are aware that we are working from in a tradition, because it's so invisible that we don't even know that we have a Western European intellectual framework. It just doesn't even, it doesn't even enter into our minds. So when I talk about working within an African-American intellectual thought framework, it is a whole different worldview. And if you're not used to understanding that you bring a worldview with you, then it's gonna be hard to shake you loose from the idea that there's anything else as valid. And, and I'm saying this as a person who understands that within this framework, I'm talking about there are people who are integrationists, there are people who are staunch Black nationalists, there are people who think we should separate from the US, there are people who are saying, no, we fought for this nation. And there are these thought traditions that are all valid. I may fall on one end or the other, but it's part of the ways in which Black scholars have framed the work of other Black intellectuals. And I'm just not sure that everyone is aware that you are working from an intellectual framework. Whether or not you know it or you can articulate it, it's still there.
Yeah, and I like the idea of like, well, I guess it's a metacritical exercise of trying to name what that tradition might be if you don't have a sense of what it is, actually. That reminds me of the kind of feminist standpoint theory about the importance that the remembering that all knowledge is constructed, our position, we have a very specific comportment to knowledge, and that we have to actually name our position in order to understand, to understand like what is the actual comportment to the information that is being, it just actually by naming your position and your framework, that is what shows that all knowledge is constructed. And I think that's probably a more useful exercise than trying to like prove something about history to people who don't want to hear that. That might just be a better, because it doesn't matter. I mean, that's part of what my work is on, like the kind of thinking about Black empiricism, right? Is it's just like, there are different ways to think about empirical knowledge. And I think when you have people who, on the other side of things, it doesn't actually matter how much more information you give them. That's not what the issue is. So I love this idea of like naming your position or framework as a way of modeling how all knowledge is itself constructed. I think that's a really great way in terms of thinking of this. And to think about like comportments to the archive that are beyond a certain kind of polarization. So I think like creative approaches to the archive, artistic works, like that can actually kind of loosen up some of these divides, and to show that there are actually other access points, I think is really crucial as well.
Yeah, and I think even more to that, there's typically an agenda even to the creation of an archive, right? So Mr. Schomburg and his compatriots were trying to prove that Black people had done something in not only in this hemisphere, but had contributed to world history. It's a very agenda-driven way of thinking about collecting. It's not just because I like these books or I think this is pretty. It is all part, and it may be pretty, and he may have liked the book, but it's still all part of an agenda to prove Black people's historical contributions or place as historic agents. And sometimes, you're not going to use any archive to prove to people that you've done anything, or that your people have done anything, or that what you say matters, or that you matter, quite frankly. And I think that's a waste of time. Again, name where you're coming from, and then we can have a conversation.
Thank you both so much for these vital contributions to really fundamental questions about history and contemporary life. And I, for one, am inspired by listening to both of you, and we'll carry this into our discussions about the semi-quincentennial and just everyday thinking about history and life. And thanks to both of you, and thanks to the New Jersey Historical Commission for hosting this conversation.
Yeah, I would like to echo the thank yous. This was an amazing session, and I would just like to let folks know that we will be sending out the resources that were mentioned today in a separate follow-up email, and that this video is going to be recorded and it's going to be on our YouTube page for future views. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and I hope that everyone has a nice day.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.